It was a rainy night in October 1972. A 26-year-old nurse named Linda Hayes left her shift at the hospital and started driving home. She never made it. Her car was found abandoned on a quiet road. The driver's side door was open. The headlights were still on. Linda's purse was still in the passenger seat, but Linda was gone. For decades, her younger sister, Karen, refused to give up. She searched old police files, followed strange tips, and even visited crime scenes herself. Everyone told her to move on. Then, in 2002, 30 years later, Karen opened something inside a dusty storage unit and found an item that made her knees buckle. It didn't just solve the case. It revealed a secret nobody was supposed to know. It was late on October 12, 1972. The halls of St. Mary's Hospital were almost empty. The smell of coffee hung in the air. Most of the night staff were in the break room, talking quietly. Linda Hayes, 26, walked out of room 214. She had just checked on her last patient for the night. She signed a chart, hung it on the door, and took off her stethoscope. She looked tired, but there was a small smile on her face. Her shift was finally over. She walked down the long hallway, past dim lights and quiet machines. She waved at the night nurse at the front desk, then pushed open the heavy glass doors. The cold air hit her. It was raining lightly, and the parking lot glistened under the streetlights. She pulled her coat tight and walked quickly to her blue sedan. Inside the car, Linda sat for a moment. She rubbed her eyes, started the engine, and let the heater warm up. It had been a long day. She was ready to get home, change into her pajamas, and watch TV with a blanket. Before pulling out, she glanced at her watch. It was just after 11:20 p.m. She reached into her purse, found a dime, and slid it into the payphone outside the hospital doors. Karen, her younger sister, had been waiting up for her. Linda thought she'd let her know she was on her way. She lifted the receiver, dialed the number, and waited for her sister to pick up. Karen picked up on the second ring. "Hey, I'm done. Heading home now," Linda said. Karen asked if she wanted to stop for food, but Linda laughed. "No, I just want my bed." They talked for less than a minute. Linda said the rain was picking up and she didn't want to be on the road too long. "Drive careful," Karen told her. "I will see you in a bit." That was it. Just a normal, simple phone call between sisters. But later, Karen would replay those words over and over in her head, trying to hear something she missed, something hidden. Because this was the last time she would ever hear her sister's voice. Linda turned onto the main road that led out of town. The windshield wipers swiped back and forth, thumping steadily. The rain was heavier now, mixed with sharp gusts of wind. The road was nearly empty. Most people were home for the night. She passed the glowing sign of the gas station, its lights reflecting off the wet pavement. A few minutes later, she left the main road and turned onto Miller's Road, a narrow, two-lane stretch lined with trees and open fields. She liked this route. It was faster, quieter. But tonight, the darkness seemed thicker. Her headlights cut through the rain, showing only a few feet ahead. Branches swayed over the road. Puddles splashed under her tires. Linda gripped the wheel a little tighter. She wasn't scared, just cautious. She knew these roads well. But somewhere behind her, far back in the dark, a pair of headlights appeared. They stayed there, not close but not fatting either. Linda checked her rearview mirror, then looked forward again. She told herself it was nothing, just another driver heading home in the rain. But on Miller's Road that night, it was not nothing. By morning, Miller's Road was quiet again. The rain had stopped, leaving the pavement slick and the air heavy. Around 6:15 a.m., a farmer driving his truck spotted something strange on the shoulder. A blue sedan, parked at an angle like it had pulled over in a hurry. He slowed down. The driver's side door was wide open. The headlights were still on. The farmer pulled over. "Hello," he called out, no answer. He stepped closer. Inside the car was a brown leather purse sitting on the passenger seat. A small makeup bag poked out the top. A hospital ID badge lay on the floorboard. The keys were still in the ignition. He looked around. The road was empty in both directions. No houses nearby, no cars coming. just quiet fields and a line of dark trees. The farmer's stomach tightened. He didn't want to touch anything. He walked back to his truck, drove to the nearest house, and used their phone to call the sheriff's office. When deputies arrived, they checked the glove box. Nothing unusual, just registration papers and a folded map. The driver's seat was pushed forward, like someone shorter had been driving. On the wet pavement below the open door, there were no footprints, just a few small puddles. One deputy looked toward the tree line. If she walked in there, we'd see tracks. But there were none. It looked like whoever was driving had simply vanished. Within an hour, Miller's Road was crawling with police cars. Yellow tape went up around the sedan. Officers moved slowly, scanning the ground for anything: a dropped key, a torn piece of fabric, a shoe print in the mud. Nothing. They checked the ditches along the road. Just water and dead leaves. A group of deputies pushed into the woods with flashlights. The ground was soft from the rain, perfect for catching footprints, but there weren't any. No broken branches, no signs of a struggle. Back at the car, an officer dusted the door handle for prints. There were smudges, but none they could clearly lift. By noon, the sheriff stood by the car looking tired. "It's like she just disappeared," he said. They towed the car to the station for processing. That night, local news ran the story. "Missing nurse," the anchor said, showing Linda's hospital photo on screen. For Karen, seeing that picture on TV was the moment it became real. Her sister was gone, and nobody knew where. When Karen got the call, she thought it was a mistake. Her sister's car on Miller's Road, door open, purse still inside. She drove there herself, gripping the wheel so hard her hands hurt. The closer she got, the more she saw flashing lights between the trees. When she stepped out, the sheriff walked over, speaking slowly, like every word had to be careful. "Karen, I think you should know we haven't found her." Karen walked past him without answering. She saw the blue sedan. The door hung open. The headlights glared into the empty road. Her sister's purse was on the seat, just like she left it. Karen's throat tightened. Linda never went anywhere without her purse. "This isn't real," Karen whispered. She circled the car, looking for something the police had missed, anything. But the ground was clean. No tracks, no dropped keys, no torn clothing. The world felt silent, like the rain had stolen all the sound. Karen backed away, her knees weak. Somewhere out there, her sister was alone, and Karen couldn't do anything but stand there. By the time the sun set, word had already traveled through the entire town. Phones rang in kitchens. Neighbors stepped onto porches, looking toward Miller's Road like it might give them answers. "Did you hear? Linda Hayes is missing." Linda wasn't just any nurse. She was the one who brought soup to sick neighbors, who showed up to school fundraisers with a smile. Everyone knew her. Everyone liked her. That night, the local diner stayed open late, buzzing with whispers. Theories spread fast. By dawn, the first search party gathered in the parking lot of the fire station. Men wore boots and carried flashlights. Women packed thermoses of coffee and sandwiches. Sheriff's deputies handed out maps. "Stay in pairs," they said. "If you find anything, don't touch it, call us." They spread out across fields, woods, and along the riverbank. But as the hours passed, nothing turned up. No one wanted to say it out loud, but the thought was growing in everyone's mind. If Linda wasn't found soon, she might never be found at all. In the days after Linda vanished, police started with the people closest to her. First was her ex-boyfriend, Mark. They had broken up a year earlier, but some neighbors said he still asked about her. Detectives sat him down in a small interview room. "Where were you that night?" they asked. Mark leaned back, crossing his arms. "At my brother's all night." Next was Tom, a hospital coworker. He was a night orderly and had been seen talking to Linda at work the week before she disappeared. "She was nice," Tom told police, "but I didn't know her well." He claimed he was working that night and signed the time sheet. Then there was a drifter. People said they saw him walking down the highway in a dark raincoat the same night Linda's car was found. Police caught up to him at a truck stop 2 towns over. He said he didn't know who Linda was. The sheriff's team wrote all 3 names on a board in the station. 3 faces, 3 stories. They checked their cars, searched their homes, asked neighbors questions. But no one had a clear link to Linda's missing night. And without hard proof, the police couldn't hold anyone. Each suspect had an alibi. Mark's brother confirmed Mark was at his house the night Linda vanished. "We were watching TV," he said, "but no one else saw them together." Tom's time sheet showed he was at the hospital, but when police checked the sign-in log, they noticed something strange. His handwriting looked different from other entries that night. When asked about it, Tom shrugged. "I was tired. Maybe I wrote sloppy." The drifter said he was hitchhiking to Chicago. A trucker backed up his story, saying he gave the man a ride hours before Linda disappeared. Still, the exact times didn't fully line up. On paper, it seemed like they were all somewhere else. But in reality, police couldn't prove it. It was like chasing smoke. Every time they thought they had something solid, it slipped away. The sheriff told his deputies, "We need more. Without it, we've got nothing." When weeks passed with no arrest, the town filled in the silence with its own theories. Some said Linda had run away. Maybe she wanted a new life, one woman whispered in the grocery store. "Girls do that sometimes." Others thought it was revenge. "She worked in a hospital," a man at the diner said. "What if she made the wrong patient angry?" One rumor claimed she was having a secret relationship. Another said she had gambling debts. None of it matched the Linda Corinne knew. She was close to her family, steady in her job, and not the type to just vanish. Corinne fought the stories at every turn. She told anyone who would listen, Linda didn't run away, someone took her. But the whispers kept growing. Police calls slowed down. The sheriff said they had no new leads in press interviews. Search parties stopped forming. Corinne felt the case slipping into the background, like her sister was disappearing twice. She started keeping her own notes, every odd comment, every strange story. She wrote them all down in a spiral notebook, hoping one day they might mean something. It was the start of her own investigation. From the first day, Corinne refused to believe the rumors. She went back to the police station again and again. She would never just leave, Corinne told the detectives. "Linda's the kind of person who calls if she's running late. If she was going anywhere, she'd tell me." One officer tried to calm her. "Sometimes people surprise us," he said gently. "No," Corinne said firmly, "not Linda." Corinne brought in photos of her sister, trying to remind them she was more than just a file. She told them about Linda's new plans to take a vacation, her excitement about redecorating her apartment, and how she had just bought a new set of nursing scrubs. "Does that sound like someone planning to run away?" she asked. Whenever police hinted they thought Linda had left on her own, Corinne pushed back. "Then where's her car? Why leave it running with her purse inside? That doesn't make sense." She started showing up at town meetings, telling people the investigation wasn't over. She even went door to door in some neighborhoods, handing out flyers and asking if anyone saw anything that night. Everywhere she went, Corinne kept repeating the same thing. "Someone took my sister. I need your help to find out who." By the end of the first year, the case file on Linda was getting dusty. Detectives had other cases, burglaries, assaults, a missing child. Linda's case was still open, but there were no new tips coming in. When Corinne called, the desk sergeant's voice sounded tired. "Ma'am, if we hear anything, we'll let you know." She knew what that meant. They had moved on. Corinne started to feel like she was carrying the whole case on her shoulders. She kept adding to her spiral notebook, names, dates, small details from conversations she overheard. One day she asked to see the sheriff. "Please," she said, "don't give up on her." He sighed. "Corinne, we haven't forgotten," but without evidence, his voice trailed off. Walking out of the station, Corinne realized she was on her own now. If she wanted answers, she would have to keep the search alive herself. So she did. Corinne cleared off the desk in her bedroom and set down a thick spiral notebook. At the top of the first page, she wrote, "Linda." She started saving everything, every tip, every letter, every newspaper clipping about her sister. When someone told her a rumor in the grocery store, she wrote it down. When a stranger called with a strange story, she wrote the date, time, and exact words they said. Friends began mailing her articles they thought might be related, even if they weren't sure. Karen kept them all. She bought manila folders, labeled them with years, and stacked them in a cardboard box. Over time, the single box turned into 2, then 3. Each folder was crammed with pages, police reports she managed to get copies of, typed notes from interviews, and hand-scribbled timelines of that night in 1972. The file became Karen's way of keeping the case alive. She read through it over and over, looking for connections the police might have missed. When people asked why she still kept it, she answered simply, "Because she's still missing." One afternoon, about 6 months after Linda vanished, Karen got a call from an older man who lived a few miles outside town. He said that on the night of the storm, he had been driving home from work. The rain was heavy, the roads nearly empty. Then he saw something strange. A man, he told Karen, walking along the shoulder, dark raincoat, hat pulled low, couldn't see his face. The man said he almost stopped, thinking the stranger might need a ride, but something about him felt wrong. He kept driving. Karen asked if he told the police. "I did," he said, "but they never came back to ask me anything else." Karen wrote it all down in her notebook. She underlined man in raincoat twice. When she called the lead detective to follow up, he said they couldn't confirm the sighting. "We get a lot of tips like that," he told her. To Karen, it wasn't just another tip. It was one more thread to pull, one more piece of a puzzle nobody else seemed interested in solving. The breathing calls, 400 words. It started one night in the winter of 1978. Karen's phone rang just after midnight. Half asleep, she answered. "Hello." No reply, just the sound of someone breathing, slow, steady, and close to the receiver. She said hello again. Nothing changed. Then the line went dead. A week later, it happened again. Same time of night, same heavy breathing. Sometimes it lasted only a few seconds, other times nearly a full minute. Karen began to dread the sound of her phone ringing after dark. She tried to trace the calls by telling the phone company, but each time, the calls were too short to track. She reported them to police, who said it could be a prank. "Kids do this sometimes," one officer told her. But Karen didn't believe it was kids. The timing felt too deliberate, too personal. The calls continued, sometimes weeks apart, sometimes back-to-back nights. And whoever it was never spoke a single word. Karen started keeping a log in her case file: dates, times, how long the caller stayed on the line. To her, it wasn't random. It was a reminder that someone out there knew what happened to Linda. In 1981, an unmarked envelope arrived at Karen's house. No return address, just her name written in block letters on the front. Inside was a single piece of fabric, torn, frayed at the edges. Karen froze. She knew the pattern instantly, small blue flowers on a white background. Linda's favorite scarf. The same one she wore almost every day in the winter of 1972. She brought it to the police. They sent it to the state lab, but the results came back with nothing useful: no fingerprints, no DNA. The fabric was too old, too handled. The officers suggested it could just be a cruel joke, but Karen didn't buy it. The piece was too specific, too exact to be random. She placed the torn scarf in a plastic evidence bag and added it to her growing case file. From then on, she checked her mailbox every day with a pit in her stomach, wondering if something else would show up. Nothing did, but the scarf stayed in her mind, not as a clue she could solve, but as a message: "I'm still here." In the summer of 1985, Karen got a call from a man who lived near the river that ran under Miller's Road Bridge. He said he'd been fishing early one morning when his hook caught on something heavy. At first, he thought it was just debris, but when he pulled it up, it was a shoe. A woman's shoe, brown leather scuffed and covered in dried mud. Inside, he said, there were reddish stains. Karen drove to his house to see it herself. The shoe was waterlogged, the sole worn thin, but it looked about Linda's size. They took it to the police. Tests were done, but like the scarf, the results didn't give any answers. The stains couldn't be confirmed as blood. Too much time had passed, and the river had washed away most evidence. Still, the location stuck with Karen. It was less than a mile from where Linda's car had been found in 1972. The police didn't pursue it further. Without proof it's hers, it's just a lost shoe, one officer said. Karen disagreed. To her, it was another piece of the same puzzle. She kept a photo of the shoe in her file, right next to the scarf. Over the years, she would drive past that bridge, staring down at the dark water, wondering if more answers were still buried beneath the current. By the late 80s, Karen had a thick file of strange clues: the breathing calls, the torn scarf, the fisherman's shoe. She brought the file to the police again, hoping the pieces might connect. But each time the answer was the same. The calls, probably a prank. The scarf could have come from anywhere. The shoe, without proof it was Linda's, it meant nothing. One detective even told her, "You're looking for patterns that aren't there." Karen left those meetings feeling like she was the only one who still cared. The more she pushed, the more they seemed to push back. Eventually, her calls to the station weren't returned as quickly. Meetings got shorter. Promises to look into it never led anywhere. To the police, Linda's case was old, cold, and not worth resources without new, solid evidence. To Karen, that attitude felt like giving up on Linda entirely, and she wasn't about to let that happen. She doubled down on her own search, keeping the file updated, checking in with anyone who might have seen or heard something new. The police could shrug, she would not. In 1989, on the anniversary of Linda's disappearance, Karen decided to do something different. She gathered family, friends, and a few neighbors at the spot where Linda's car had been found. As the sun set, they lit candles and stood in a circle. Some prayed, some stayed quiet. Everyone thought of Linda. Karen spoke a few words about her sister, her laugh, her kindness, her work as a nurse. She ended by saying, "We won't stop until we know what happened." A local reporter covered the vigil, and the story ran in the next day's paper. That brought more people the following year, and the year after that. It became a tradition. Every year, same night, same spot. For Karen, the vigils were a way to keep Linda's name alive, to remind the town and the police that this wasn't just a cold case file. It was her sister's life. The candles would burn for hours, glowing against the darkness, while Karen silently promised Linda she would never stop looking. In the first few years, the vigils felt powerful. Dozens of people showed up. Some came from other towns just to stand with Karen. But as time passed, faces started disappearing. By 1992, only a handful of people came, mostly close family and one or two loyal friends. The media stopped covering it. Even the police didn't bother sending an officer anymore. Karen understood why. People moved on. They got busy with their own lives, but it still hurt. She looked around at the small group holding candles and felt the weight of the years pressing down. Every face seemed to be asking the same silent question: is this all we can do? The hope that once filled the gatherings now felt paper-thin. Still, Karen refused to let it end. Even if it was just her, she would stand there every year. She believed that somewhere out there, someone knew what happened to Linda. Maybe the person responsible was even watching, knowing the pain they'd caused. Karen wanted them to see she hadn't given up and never would. Even if hope was fading for everyone else, she would keep the flame alive. By the mid-90s, Karen's small home office looked more like a detective's workspace than anything else. Against one wall sat a long bookshelf. Every shelf was packed with binders, big, heavy ones labeled by year. Inside were newspaper clippings, photocopied police reports, and her own handwritten notes from interviews she'd done herself. She spoken to old neighbors, former coworkers, anyone who might know even the smallest detail. Every tip, no matter how strange or unlikely, was recorded. Every rumor was written down. She even kept a map with colored pins showing every location connected to Linda's case. Where the car was found, where clues had surfaced, where possible suspects had lived. Karen joked sometimes that she had a better case file than the police. But behind the joke was a hard truth. If she didn't keep track, no one would. Those binders became her private archive, her way of making sure Linda's story never got buried. Every time she added a new page, she thought, one day this will matter. It was a quiet afternoon in 2001 when Corinne's phone rang. The voice on the other end was a man she didn't know. His tone was nervous, like he wasn't sure if he should even be calling. He said his father had passed away a few weeks earlier. While he was going through his father's things, he found a handwritten note. The note mentioned a nurse in 72 and a bad thing I can't forget. Corinne froze. Her mind instantly went to Linda. The man explained that in his father's final days he had talked about knowing what happened to a nurse decades earlier. The details were messy. His father never said a name, never gave a full story, but the son felt it was important. Corinne's pulse was racing. After nearly 30 years of dead ends, she had trained herself not to get her hopes up. But this was different. This wasn't a rumor from a neighbor or gossip at the grocery store. This was a confession from a dying man. She asked the caller if his father ever said how he knew. That's when he told her something that made her sit up in her chair. The man said his father once rented a small storage unit just outside of town. It had been sitting there for years, untouched. And inside, according to his father, was something he was afraid to throw away. The man didn't know what it was. He hadn't been inside yet, the key had been lost, and he didn't want to mess with it. But he thought Corinne should know. Her mind was spinning. Could it be connected to Linda? Or was this just another strange, meaningless story? The man gave her the address of the storage facility. Corinne hung up the phone, staring at the scrap of paper in her hand. She called the police immediately, telling them everything the man had said. She expected urgency, maybe even a detective meeting her there within the hour. Instead, she got a sigh on the other end of the line. It was interesting, the officer said, but without specific proof it was tied to Linda, they couldn't justify getting a warrant or putting resources into it. Corinne hung up, frustrated. If the police weren't going to check, she would. The next day, Corinne drove to the storage facility herself. The manager, an older man in a baseball cap, looked at her suspiciously when she asked about the unit. She explained the story, leaving out a few details, but made it clear this could be important. At first, he shook his head. "We can't just let anyone in. It's not your unit." Corinne kept talking, explaining who she was, what had happened to her sister, how long she had been searching. She could see his expression soften. Finally, he said, "That unit hasn't been opened in years. Rent been paid, but no one's touched it." She asked if they could open it together. After a long pause, he agreed. The lock was old and rusty. When he broke it off and pulled the door up, the smell of dust and stale air rushed out. Inside were stacks of boxes, some old furniture, and near the back, a small locked trunk. Corinne felt her heart pounding. Whatever was inside might finally tell her what happened to Linda. Corinne didn't sleep that night. By morning, she had made up her mind. If the police wouldn't act, she would. She got in her car and drove straight to the storage facility. The drive felt longer than it was, her hands gripping the wheel, her jaw tight. When she walked into the small office, the man behind the counter looked up from his paperwork. "I need to ask you about a unit," Corinne said, her voice firm. She told him the number the caller had given her. The manager frowned. "Are you the renter?" "No," Corinne admitted, "but this is connected to an unsolved case. My sister went missing in 1972. Someone told me their father kept something in that unit that might be evidence." The man leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "We don't get involved in police matters." Corinne leaned in, her voice steady. "The police aren't involved. They don't care anymore. But I do. And if there's even a chance something in there could help me find my sister, I need to see it." He didn't answer right away. He just studied her face, like he was trying to decide if she was telling the truth. Finally, the manager sighed and pushed his chair back. "That unit," he said slowly, "hasn't been opened in years. Rent always paid in cash. No name on the paperwork except for F. Howard. No phone number, no address. Whoever owns it doesn't want to be found." Corinne's stomach sank. "So you do know who it belongs to?" "Not really," he said. "All I know is the payment started back in the late 70s. Never late, never missed. Once a year, cash in an envelope, that's it." She asked if anyone had ever come to check on the unit. He shook his head. Not in the time I've worked here, and I've been here 15 years. For all I know, what's inside could be junk, or it could be something no one wants to see. His eyes met hers. If you open it, you might not like what you find. Karen's voice was quiet. I've been living with not knowing for almost 30 years. I'll take that risk. The manager hesitated, then finally reached for a set of old keys hanging on the wall. The manager slid the metal door upward, and it rattled loudly as it rolled open. Karen stepped forward, and a wave of musty air hit her. It smelled like old paper, mildew, and dust that had been trapped for decades. The inside was dim, lit only by a flickering bulb hanging from the ceiling. She could see old furniture covered with yellowed sheets, their shapes sagging and strange. Boxes were stacked in uneven towers, some collapsing under their own weight. Karen brushed her hand over the top of a box, leaving a clean streak in the thick dust. She coughed as particles floated in the light. "Looks like no one's touched this in years," the manager said quietly from behind her. She began walking slowly down a narrow path between the piles. A cracked picture frame leaned against the wall. A rusted lamp sat on a wobbly table. Most of it looked worthless, like it belonged in a landfill. But Karen kept going, her eyes searching for anything that didn't belong, anything that felt personal. Near the back, she noticed the boxes grew fewer, and the space became more open. That's when she saw it, something different, something that made her stop. In the far corner of the unit, half hidden in shadows, sat a small trunk. It was the only thing in the room that looked deliberate, not abandoned. Karen stepped closer. The trunk was old, made of wood with metal edges, its surface scratched and dented. A thick padlock hung from the latch. She crouched down, running her fingers over the lid. It was heavy, solid. "This isn't furniture," she said quietly. "Someone put this here for a reason." The manager frowned. "Could be tools, could be junk. You can't just open it, that's not allowed without the renter's permission." Karen stood and faced him. "Then get the permission or cut it open. I came here for this." He hesitated. "Ma'am, if there's something inside that ties to whatever you're looking for, I don't want to be part of it." Karen didn't back down. "You already are." The silence stretched before the manager finally muttered, "I'll get the bolt cutters." As he walked away, Karen stayed with the trunk, her hand still resting on it. Her heart pounded. Whatever was inside could change everything, or it could be another dead end. But deep down, she felt it. This was the reason she was here. The manager returned with a pair of heavy bolt cutters. He stood there for a moment, gripping them tightly. "You sure you want to do this?" he asked. Karen didn't even blink. "Yes." He stepped forward, placing the jaws of the cutters around the padlock. With a loud snap, the lock broke and clattered to the floor. Karen's hands were trembling as she reached for the latch. She paused for just a second, staring at the trunk like it might explode. Then she lifted the lid. The hinges squealed. A faint smell of mothballs and old fabric drifted up. Inside, she could see several objects, all neatly placed as if someone had taken great care to store them. Right on top was a large plastic bag, sealed with tape. She set it aside. Beneath it was a smaller box, the kind used for personal keepsakes. She opened it slowly. Inside were folded papers, envelopes, and what looked like small photographs. Karen's breath caught. The deeper she looked, the more she realized these weren't random belongings. Every item seemed connected to one thing. Linda. Her pulse quickened. She reached for the largest object in the trunk and froze when she saw what it was. Karen lifted it out slowly. It was a nurse's uniform, neatly folded, sealed inside a clear plastic garment bag. The fabric was pale blue, the kind she'd seen Linda wear 100 times. Her fingers pressed against the plastic. It felt soft but fragile, like it had been stored for decades. On the chest was a hospital badge, still pinned in place. Karen stared at the photo on the badge. It was Linda smiling, her hair pulled back, her eyes bright. The name printed underneath read, Linda Hayes. Her throat tightened. She could almost hear her sister's voice, see her walking out of the hospital for the last time. The manager stood silently in the doorway, his eyes wide. "This has been in here all these years." Karen asked, her voice shaking. He nodded slowly. Karen didn't say anything else. She held the uniform in her lap for a long moment, as if afraid that putting it down would make it disappear. Then she looked back into the trunk. Something else was inside, something that explained why this uniform was here at all. Beneath the uniform was a bundle of papers tied together with string. Karen untied it and lifted the stack out. The pages were yellowed and brittle. As she spread them out on the trunk lid, she realized they were all old newspaper articles. Every single one had her sister's name in the headline. Local nurse missing, car found abandoned. Family begs for help in search. No leads in vanishing of Linda Hayes. Karen's hands shook as she turned each page. The dates spanned from 1972 to the early 1980s. Some were clipped neatly, others were torn roughly from the paper. There were even a few photocopies with handwritten notes in the margins, things like "check witness" or "ask about Miller's Road." Karen's stomach turned. Whoever had kept these hadn't just been following the case. They had been studying it. She looked back into the trunk. If someone had this much about Linda, why had they never come forward? Her mind raced as she stared at the pile in front of her. This wasn't just storage. This was someone's secret archive. At the very bottom of the trunk was a small envelope. It was unmarked, sealed with brittle tape. Karen peeled it open. Inside was a stack of Polaroid photographs, their white borders stained with age. She pulled the first one out and froze. It was Linda. She was sitting on a wooden chair in what looked like a dim basement. The walls behind her were bare cement. Her hands were in her lap, but her shoulders were tense. Her eyes wide, terrified. Karen swallowed hard and pulled out the next photo. Same basement. Linda in the same chair, but now her head was turned toward the camera, as if someone had just called her name. Another photo, closer this time, her expression pleading. Karen's hands began to shake so badly that the pictures slipped from her fingers and scattered across the floor. She dropped to her knees, scooping them up, trying not to see but unable to look away. In the last image, Linda's face was partly in shadow. She looked exhausted, like hours or days had passed. Karen realized these weren't random snapshots. Someone had taken these while holding her sister captive. The cold from the concrete floor seeped into her legs, but Karen didn't move. The Polaroids lay in her lap. Her chest felt tight, like all the air in the room had been sucked out. She tried to take a deep breath but couldn't. Her hands were numb, her vision blurry. Somewhere in the background, the manager was speaking, his voice low, hesitant, but the words didn't register. All she could see was Linda's face, not in the smiling photo on the hospital badge, not in the happy memories, but here trapped, afraid, alive in those moments, and then gone. Tears blurred the images. Karen blinked them away and gripped the photos so hard the edges bent. Her stomach churned. She wanted to scream, but no sound came out. 30 years of wondering had led to this. Not closure, not peace, but proof that her sister's last days were filled with fear. She leaned forward, resting her forehead on her knees. The photos slipped from her lap and landed on the floor again. Karen didn't pick them up. For the first time in her life, she felt like she might not have the strength to keep going. Karen didn't remember calling them. One moment, she was still sitting on the cold floor. The next, detectives were stepping into the storage unit, their gloves snapping on. They moved quickly but carefully. One officer knelt beside the trunk, lifting each item out and placing it into separate evidence bags. The uniform, the stack of yellowed newspaper articles, the Polaroids. Each was sealed, labeled, and carried to a waiting van. Karen stood back against the wall, arms crossed tight against her chest. Every bag that left the room felt like another piece of Linda disappearing from her hands. She wanted to hold on to them, to not let anyone take them away. But she knew this was the right move. For the first time in years, police were treating something like real evidence. A detective glanced at her. "We'll get these to the lab tonight. You'll be updated." Karen nodded but didn't answer. Her voice wouldn't work. When the last bag was taken, the trunk sat empty in the middle of the unit, its lid hanging open like a mouth frozen mid-sentence. For Karen, The silence felt heavier than the lock she'd broken. Hours later, Karen sat in the police station, staring at copies of the Polaroids. She looked at them before, but this time, she forced herself to notice every detail: the walls, the chair, the lighting, the shadows. In the third photo, something caught her eye. In the top right corner, partly out of frame, was an arm. It was Linda's. The skin was tanned with dark hair on the forearm, and on the inside of the wrist was a small, distinct tattoo, a simple anchor. Karen's breath caught. She knew that tattoo. Years earlier, she'd seen it on a man who lived in town, someone who'd always given her a bad feeling. He'd worked odd jobs, drank too much, and had been questioned once in connection with a break-in. He was also the man who used to hang around the hospital parking lot at night. Karen's hands tightened on the photo. The detective across the table noticed. "Something?" he asked. Karen turned the photo toward him and pointed. "That tattoo. I know whose arm that is." The room went still. For the first time in a long time, Karen felt the weight shift, like the case had just taken a step forward. Digging into records, 400 words. Detectives didn't waste time. The anchor tattoo was all they needed to start pulling files. They ran his name, Frank Barlow. The database lit up with old records, police reports, job applications, even a hospital staff file from the early 70s. Frank had worked as a janitor at County General Hospital for just under a year. His personnel record showed a mix of short-term jobs before that: gas stations, warehouses, a seasonal construction crew. Most ended suddenly. No references. The police notes were thin but disturbing. Twice, he'd been questioned in connection with late-night disturbances in the hospital parking lot. One note from a patrol officer read, "Subject loitering near nurse's wing entrance. Claims he was waiting for a friend." There was also an old complaint from a nurse who said Frank made unwanted comments and wouldn't leave her alone. The file didn't name her. Then came a memo stamped confidential. It was from hospital administration to security. "Frank Barlow terminated. Issue trespass warning. Do not allow back on property." Karen sat across from the lead detective as he closed the folder. "Looks like Frank knew Linda," he said quietly. Karen's first question was the one that mattered most. "Where is he now?" The detective glanced at another file. His voice dropped. "Frank Barlow died in 1999. Karen froze. He explained that Frank had been living alone in a rented cabin outside town. He suffered a massive heart attack and was found by a neighbor. No foul play suspected. It was 2 years before the anonymous caller reached Karen, and decades after Linda's disappearance. For Karen, it felt like the ground had just given way. The man in the photos, the tattoo, the name she now knew, all of it had been right there, but they could never question him. "Dead men don't confess," she said softly. Still, the detective wasn't ready to close the book. "Even if he's gone, what he left behind might still tell us something. People like Frank, they don't throw away trophies." Karen thought of the trunk, the uniform, the photos. All of it had been hidden for years, paid for in cash so no one would notice. If Frank had more, it might still be out there. But Karen also knew the truth. The only person who could explain what happened to Linda had taken those answers to the grave. The next morning, detectives dug deeper into the hospital archives. In a box of old incident reports, they found it, a typed statement dated just weeks before Linda vanished. It was from Linda herself. The report said Frank had followed her into the staff parking lot after her shift. He blocked her path, accused her of talking about him to others, and told her she needed to be careful. Linda wrote that his tone made her afraid. She reported the incident to her supervisor the next morning. The hospital investigated and fired Frank within the week. A trespass order was filed with local police. Karen read the statement with her hands trembling. This wasn't just a coincidence. Frank had been angry enough to confront her sister alone at night. And then weeks later, Linda disappeared. For Karen, the timeline was no longer blurry. First came the threat, then came the firing, then came the night on Miller's Road. While going through county property records, detectives found something they hadn't known before: In the 70s, Frank owned a small rental house just outside town. It was less than 2 miles from Miller's Road. The property record included a hand-drawn floor plan from when the house was built. There, in the back corner, was a basement marked storage. Detectives drove out to see it, but the house had been torn down years ago. A newer home stood on the lot. The current owner said they'd filled in the basement during renovations. Karen pictured the Polaroids Linda in a dim, enclosed space. No windows, concrete walls. If those pictures had been taken in that basement, it meant Linda had been held terrifyingly close to where she was last seen. The lead detective called it the most important missing piece we'll never touch. The space was gone, the evidence, if it had been there, buried under years of dirt and concrete. For Karen, it was another gut punch. Every clue pointed to Frank, but so much had already slipped away. News about Frank's name getting tied to the case spread fast in town. Within days, 2 retired nurses came forward. They both worked with Linda in 1972. One remembered Frank clearly, the janitor who lingered near the nurses' station. She said he had a habit of staring at Linda, even when she wasn't speaking to him. It wasn't just casual, she told police. It was like he was studying her. The second nurse recalled an incident in the hospital cafeteria. Frank sat 2 tables away, pretending to read a newspaper, but his eyes never left Linda. Then a former neighbor of Frank's reached out. He'd lived on the same road as the small rental house with the basement. He said Frank was quiet but strange. One night, just after Linda vanished, he saw Frank loading something into his car trunk around 2 a.m. The neighbor thought it was furniture, but it was covered with a tarp. Police took every statement seriously, logging them into the file. Karen listened to each one. For her, it wasn't about proving Frank was the man in the photos. She already believed that. It was about building a picture of who he was. And every new detail made him seem darker, more dangerous, and closer to Linda than anyone ever realized. The uniform from the trunk had been sealed in an evidence bag for months, while forensic tests were run. Karen waited for the call she both feared and needed. One morning the detective finally rang. His voice was steady, but the words hit hard. The lab matched the DNA. It's Linda's. The scientists had swabbed the inside collar and the fabric around the sleeves. Tiny skin cells, preserved after all these years, had been compared to a sample from Linda's old hairbrush that Karen had kept. It was a perfect match. Karen's knees felt weak. On one hand, this proved without doubt that Linda had been in that uniform, that the items in the trunk were real, not some cruel trick. On the other hand, it meant the photos were real too. Police noted that the DNA didn't tell them when the uniform was worn or how Linda ended up in it that night, but it was the strongest physical evidence they'd ever had. For Karen, it was one more step toward truth, but also one step deeper into the reality of what had been taken from her family. After the DNA results, detectives made it official. They believed Linda had been killed in 1972, but without a body, they couldn't confirm when, where, or how. Karen struggled with the news. For years, part of her had clung to the idea that Linda might be out there somewhere, maybe hurt, maybe trapped, but alive. That hope was now almost gone. At the same time, she felt an unexpected wave of relief. She wasn't crazy. She hadn't imagined the danger Linda had been in. Everything she'd suspected was now backed by hard science. Police filed the case as an open homicide, meaning it would stay active but unlikely to move forward without new evidence. For Karen, that wasn't good enough. She wanted the truth spelled out, every step, every name. She wanted someone to stand in court and admit what had been done. But all she had was proof of presence and 1,000 unanswered questions. The case still had no body, no confession, and no trial. Just a mother's fight, still burning after nearly 30 years. After the DNA results, Karen decided it was time to give Linda the goodbye she never got. She started making calls to family members, old friends, and the few townspeople who still remembered the case. She told them she wanted to hold a memorial service, not just for closure, but to make sure Linda's name would never fade away. The local church agreed to host it. The pastor offered the hall for free. People volunteered to bring food, flowers, and framed photos of Linda from her school years and nursing days. Karen worked late every night that week, writing out the order of events. She asked a few people to speak, old coworkers from the hospital, neighbors from when they were kids, even one retired officer who had searched the woods back in 1972. She printed programs with Linda's picture on the cover, smiling in her nurse's cap. When the day came, the pews filled slowly. Some faces were familiar, others Karen hadn't seen in decades. For the first time in years, the case didn't feel like evidence in files. It felt like Linda was right there, surrounded by people who cared. When it was Karen's turn to speak, she walked to the front of the church holding a folded piece of paper. She started with a small laugh, telling everyone how Linda used to sing while cooking breakfast, even when she couldn't remember the words. She talked about how Linda always stayed late at the hospital if a patient was scared to be alone. Karen's voice broke as she remembered the summer before Linda disappeared. They had spent every weekend at the lake, sharing secrets on the dock. Linda had been saving to buy her own car, dreaming about taking a road trip across the country. She was more than a case file, Karen said, looking out at the crowd. She was my sister. She was the person I told everything to, and someone took her away from us. She paused, letting the silence fill the room. I can't bring her back, Karen continued, but I can make sure she's never forgotten. The crowd sat still, listening. Some were crying. For the first time in years, Karen felt she wasn't carrying the weight alone. At the end of the service, Karen stood beside a small table at the front of the church. On it sat a shadow box, a wooden frame with a glass front. Inside, she had arranged Linda's nurse's uniform folded neatly. Next to it, the hospital badge with her photo and the name, Linda Hayes. The items had been returned to her after the police finished processing them. At first, Karen didn't know what to do with them. She couldn't put them in a closet, but she also couldn't leave them in the open as a daily reminder. The shadow box felt right. It was safe. It was respectful. Karen lifted the uniform gently, smoothing it one last time before placing it inside. She set the badge just above it. Then she closed the glass and locked it. "This is not the end," she said quietly, but loud enough for those nearby to hear. "This is just where we keep her memory safe." People lined up to view the display, some touching the glass softly. Karen stood nearby, greeting each person, watching their faces. It wasn't justice, but it was something she could hold on to. After the memorial, Karen sat alone in her living room, the shadow box resting on the mantel. She thought about the years behind her, the endless phone calls, the late-night drives, the interviews with strangers who swore they knew something. Most of those tips went nowhere. Many days she'd felt like she was chasing smoke. But she remembered the promise she made to herself in 1972. "I will not stop until I know what happened." Even when her friends told her to move on, even when police stopped returning her calls, even when she was the only one showing up to vigils, she kept going. Karen realized it wasn't just about solving the case. It was about honoring Linda. Every step, every binder full of notes, every sleepless night, it had been for her sister. Now she finally had answers. Not all of them, but enough to know Linda's story was real, not just a rumor in an old file. She had kept her promise, and in her heart, she knew if it had been the other way around, Linda would have done the same for her. Weeks later, Karen got a letter from the police department. It was short and formal. The investigation into Linda Hayes' disappearance was officially closed. They believed Frank was responsible. The uniform, the photos, the witness accounts, it all pointed to him. But with no body and no living suspect, there would be no trial, no final day in court. Karen read the letter twice, then set it down. She felt two things at once: relief that she finally had the truth, and anger that Linda never got justice. She knew some people would see the case as over, but for Karen, the fight wasn't something she could just turn off. She still visited the shadow box every morning. She still drove past Miller's Road sometimes, just to remind herself where it all began. She still talked about Linda to anyone who would listen, not just about how she died, but how she lived. The police might have closed the file, but Corinne's heart stayed open. She would carry Linda's memory forward for the rest of her life. Because even without a courtroom verdict, she had one truth no one could take away. Linda mattered. The camera moves slowly through Corinne's quiet home. The walls are lined with family photos. Some are old and faded, showing two little girls, Corinne and Linda, laughing in their backyard. Others are newer, taken at the memorial, surrounded by candles. The shot moves toward a single wall in the living room. In the center hangs the shadow box. Inside, Linda's neatly folded nurse's uniform, her hospital badge, and a small engraved plate with her name. The glass catches the light from the window, making it almost glow. There's no music, just the faint ticking of a clock. Corinne walks into frame. She stops in front of the box, looking at it quietly. Her hand rises and rests on the glass. She doesn't speak. She doesn't need to. Everything is here, decades of searching, every dead end, every late-night phone call, every argument with police, every tear, every moment of hope. The uniform isn't just cloth. It's proof that Linda existed, that she mattered, that someone loved her enough to never stop looking. The camera stays on Corinne for a moment longer. Her shoulders drop slightly, as if some weight, not all of it, but enough, has finally lifted. She turns away, walking slowly down the hall. The camera doesn't follow her. It stays on the shadow box. The clock keeps ticking. The house stays quiet. The frame lingers on the uniform until the edges fade to black. A line of text appears. In memory of Linda Hayes, 1949 to 1972. Then another. For everyone still searching. Fade out.